Berlin, January 30th, 1943. A gray dawn settles over the city. Frost glitters on the roofs, the air thick with the cold stillness of wartime routine. Inside the ornate radio hall, Hermann Göring adjusts his uniform, the diamonds on his baton catching the studio light. The broadcast has begun. His voice, grand and defiant, echoing across the Reich. The celebration of Hitler's rise to power. Then, a faint vibration rolls through the floor. At first, it's dismissed as thunder, but the sound grows, sharp, rapid, like tearing air. Technicians freeze. Outside, two sleek shapes appear from the clouds. British de Havilland Mosquitoes, wooden aircraft flying low and impossibly fast. The sirens wail too late. Explosions hammer the city blocks around the radio building. Dust rains down inside the hall. Göring's voice cuts to static. When he bursts outside, the sky is already empty. The raiders gone, before a single interceptor could take off. A wooden plane, built in a furniture factory, had just humiliated the master of the Luftwaffe. Chautreuil, morning would spark Göring's most desperate obsession and expose the limits of a regime that could command everything, except imagination. When war broke over Europe in September 1939, the Luftwaffe stood at its zenith, sleek, metallic, and sure of its invincibility. Germany's air arm was the pride of the Reich, a symbol of industrial might forged from steel, aluminum, and precision engineering. Across the Channel, Britain looked battered, blockaded, and short of nearly everything, especially metals. Out of that scarcity came a question no one else was bold enough to ask. What if the future of flight didn't depend on metal at all? Geoffrey de Havilland, a quiet, stubborn engineer, offered an answer. In 1939, he proposed an aircraft built almost entirely of wood, a light, unarmed twin-engine machine that would rely on speed, not guns, for survival. The Air Ministry laughed. Wood, they said, was for furniture, not bombers. De Havilland persisted. Britain's supply lines were collapsing, and carpenters were more plentiful than aluminum. His proposal was accepted as a long shot, a gamble born of desperation. By 1940, his small team at Hatfield was bending sheets of birch and balsa into a sleek, bullet-shaped fuselage. The secret lay in a German invention, tegofilm, a phenolic resin glue that bonded layers of wood into a material stronger than aluminum. Britain had quietly imported it before the war and perfected its use. In November 1940, the prototype took flight. Test pilots returned stunned. The de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito hit 382 miles per hour, faster than any fighter then flying. When its first production variant entered service in 1941, the Mosquito upended everything the experts believed about combat aircraft. It was faster than interceptors, steadier than bombers, and light enough to outclimb pursuit. The absence of armor and gun turrets made it agile, its smooth wooden skin sliced through radar reflections. To the British, it was proof that intellect could outfly intimidation. To the Germans, it was an insult that burned. By late 1942, mosquitoes were ranging over occupied Europe. They photographed shipyards, airfields, and industrial zones with impunity. They struck at Gestapo headquarters in Oslo and Copenhagen, blew open prison walls, and vanished before the Luftwaffe could react. Even the night skies were no refuge. Radar-equipped mosquito fighters hunted bombers and intruders alike. Berlin's civilians gave the wooden intruders a nickname whispered with awe and resentment: Der Holzgeist, the wooden ghost. For Hermann Göring, the Luftwaffe's flamboyant commander-in-chief, that ghost became personal. He had once promised Hitler that Germany's skies were impregnable. Yet here were British bombers, wooden bombers, raiding the capital in broad daylight, leaving the Reich's proud defenses swatting at shadows. Reports from radar stations infuriated him. fleeting signals, impossible speeds, vanishing contacts. He ordered captured wreckage sent to his desk. Technicians laid out fragments of plywood and balsa before the Reichsmarschall. He could not comprehend how this could be faster than his Messerschmitts. To Göring, it was blasphemy. Germany was the land of engineers, of metal and mathematics. Britain, starving and short of resources, had somehow built a better machine from household materials. He thundered through meetings. If the British can build from wood, then Germany will build from genius. His words carried the weight of command and of humiliation. Within weeks, orders were issued to Focke-Wulf, Heinkel, and Junkers. Design a high-speed, wooden multi-role aircraft capable of matching the Mosquito's performance. Göring demanded results in months, not years. His pride would allow nothing less. But the order arrived at the worst possible moment. Allied bombers were hammering German factories nightly. Fuel was scarce, aluminum rationed, and skilled craftsmen drafted to the front. The aviation industry that had once dazzled the world was now held together by paperwork and fear. Still, one man accepted the impossible assignment: Kurt Tank, the respected designer of the F-190 fighter. His proposal for a twin-engine wooden night fighter became the Focke-Wulf Ta-154 Mosquito. On paper, it promised parity with the British Marvel. Radar-equipped, fast, and built largely of non-strategic materials. The irony was cruel. The project's success depended on the same adhesive that had made the Mosquito possible: Tego film. But the Allies bombed the Wuppertal plant that produced it in 1943, wiping out Germany's only supply. Chemists rushed to make substitutes, brewing glues in makeshift labs. The replacement worked, until it didn't. Acidic vapors corroded the very wood they were meant to bind. Test pilots soon discovered the horror firsthand. Wings that cracked, fuselages that peeled apart. The German Mosquito was eating itself from the inside, yet Göring refused to hear it. Pride demanded progress, even as the glue dissolved. And so the race began, between a free nation perfecting a miracle of craftsmanship and a dictatorship racing to copy it through fear. By early 1943, Göring's demand for a German Mosquito had become an obsession. Every failed interception, every daylight raid by the British wooden aircraft was a public insult to his authority. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, his temper became legendary. He shouted at engineers, blamed subordinates, and threatened entire departments with dismissal. But his rage could not fix what bureaucracy and fear had already broken. Kurt Tank's Ta-154 program, named Mosquito in bitter imitation, moved forward under impossible conditions. Factories at Langenhagen and Parchim were ordered to construct prototypes even as they repaired bomb damage nightly. Supply chains were collapsing. Aluminum was reserved for fighters. Rubber, fuel, and electronics were rationed by the ounce. To conserve metal, Tank turned to laminated birch and beech. The material worked in theory, but Germany lacked the craftsmen to shape it. Before the war, carpenters had been plentiful. Now they were soldiers or dead. In their place came untrained laborers, prisoners, and conscripts. The Reich that prided itself on precision engineering was suddenly forced to rediscover woodworking, a skill it had dismissed as primitive. The irony stung. Still, Göring demanded results. On July 1, 1943, the first prototype took flight. Observers held their breath. To everyone's relief, it flew beautifully, fast, agile, responsive. Reports claimed a top speed of nearly 390 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe High Command seized on this as redemption. At last, a victory of German science. Göring ordered immediate production even before testing was complete. But reality soon returned with brutal clarity. A few weeks later, the second prototype disintegrated on landing. Investigators found acid corrosion in the glue joints. The substitute adhesive, Lackklebstoff 263, had eaten into the wooden layers? Every airframe in construction was now suspect. Göring refused to believe it. Sabotage, he declared, blaming Allied spies, factory workers, and even the weather. The engineers knew the truth. The Reich's chemical industry, stretched thin by synthetic fuel production, could not replicate the original formula. The Tego film resin, a marvel of pre-war German chemistry, was gone forever. No amount of intimidation could bring it back. Even so, Göring pressed onward. The Ta-154 was too symbolic to fail. He saw it not merely as a plane, but as revenge, an answer to the British insult that had wounded his pride. He issued a directive. This aircraft will prove that German ingenuity cannot be outdone by British carpenters. It was a tragic miscalculation. While German engineers fought chemistry and bureaucracy, the Mosquito's legend grew faster than its shadow. By mid-1943, British crews were striking Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne in broad daylight. They photographed targets, bombed radio stations, and flew home before radar screens even settled. On January 30th, 1943, the very raid that had interrupted Göring's live speech, Mosquitoes had timed their approach to the exact minute of the broadcast, silencing his voice with explosions heard across Europe. The Reichsmarshal's humiliation was complete, yet the more he tried to erase it, the deeper it sank. At Focke-Wulf, Kurt Tank worked under immense pressure. He redesigned the Ta-154 repeatedly. New glue formulas, metal fittings, altered wing geometry, but the failures multiplied. Each prototype seemed cursed. One disintegrated mid-air. Another burst into flames on the runway. Even when it flew well, the production quality was inconsistent. Parts from different factories didn't fit. Jigs warped. Measurements drifted. Germany's famed efficiency was gone, replaced by exhaustion and chaos. Parallel to Tank's effort, Ernst Heinkel's team at Rostock developed the He-219 Uhu, a partial wooden night fighter equipped with radar and heavy cannons. It was a more capable machine, but bureaucratic infighting strangled it before mass production began. Göring's deputy, Erhard Milch, despised Heinkel personally and blocked approval out of spite. By the time Hitler intervened, it was too late. In the skies, the Mosquito ruled unchallenged. RAF squadrons used it for precision strikes that embarrassed the Reich's propaganda machine. One mission bombed Gestapo headquarters in Oslo. Another hit the Shell House in Copenhagen. Each was a surgical strike that reinforced a single truth. Britain's wooden wonder could reach anywhere. Inside Germany, that truth became psychological warfare. Civilians heard the approaching hum of twin Merlin engines and whispered, "The wooden ones are coming." To Göring, the humiliation turned inward. He began describing the Mosquito with envy bordering on admiration. In one recorded conversation, he admitted, "They have the geniuses, and we have the bureaucrats." He was right. The Reich's scientific brilliance had been buried under its own arrogance. By late 1943, the Ta-154, his wooden answer to the British miracle, stood as a symbol of everything wrong with the Nazi war machine. Intelligent people trapped in a system that rewarded obedience over truth. And as the Mosquito streaked over Berlin once more, Göring could only watch from the ground, staring at the contrails fading into the winter sky, proof that his empire of steel had been outflown by a nation of carpenters. By 1944, the Battle of the Wooden Plains had become far more than an engineering contest. It was a confrontation between two ways of thinking, between flexibility and control, between innovation born of freedom and invention crushed by fear. The first angle is technological. The de Havilland Mosquito was not just a clever design, it was a revolution disguised in simplicity. Its fuselage was made from a sandwich of birch plywood around a balsa core, bonded with resin, and then wrapped in smooth layers of doped fabric. The result was astonishingly strong and light. The aircraft's wooden skin created a continuous aerodynamic surface free of rivets, reducing drag and radar reflection alike. Britain's engineers perfected this, not in vast hangars, but in furniture factories and piano workshops. Each part was shaped by hand, tested, and fitted by craftsmen who treated aircraft as art. The key to its success was its glue, that same Tego film resin, ironically of German origin, which bonded wood so tightly that the joint was stronger than the grain itself. When Germany tried to replicate it, the chemistry became its curse. With Wuppertal's Tego film factory destroyed, substitutes were rushed into service. Crude phenolic resins brewed in laboratories under pressure from the Air Ministry. These replacements were acidic. They looked stable at first, but time turned them to poison. Within weeks, acid seeped through the plywood, softening it, corroding nails and fittings. Test aircraft fell apart in mid-air. Göring's scientists blamed sabotage. Kurt Tank blamed bureaucracy. The truth was simpler. Germany's once great chemical industry was exhausted, rationed, and crippled by Allied bombing. The very system that prided itself on precision could no longer guarantee purity in a barrel of glue. The second angle is industrial. Britain's success rested on decentralization. The Mosquito's parts came from hundreds of small workshops scattered across the countryside. When one factory was bombed, another took over. Piano makers, cabinet shops, and even toy companies contributed components. It was wartime improvisation turned into an art form. Germany, by contrast, centralized everything. Focke-Wulf and Heinkel factories were chained to schedules dictated by the Luftwaffe's bureaucracy. Each production change required signed approval from the Reich Air Ministry, sometimes from Göring himself. Even trivial adjustments triggered weeks of paperwork. When Kurt Tank requested a delay to test a new glue mixture, he was reprimanded for defeatism. When a test pilot refused to fly an untested airframe, he was replaced. In Britain, problems were solved on the floor. In Germany, they were punished. By 1944, Allied intelligence estimated that 400 firms across Britain were involved in mosquito production, while Germany's equivalent projects involved barely a dozen. Flexibility had become the difference between progress and paralysis. The third angle is strategic. The Mosquito was built around a radical concept. Speed is armor. It carried no defensive guns. Its best defense was to avoid combat altogether. At high altitude, it outran fighters. At low altitude, it flew too fast for flak. Its dual Merlin engines gave it the range of a bomber and the agility of a fighter. This philosophy infuriated Göring. The Luftwaffe's doctrine prized heavy aircraft, armored, multi-purpose, armed to the teeth. To him, a plane without guns was an insult to German logic. When the first Mosquito raids struck Berlin, he dismissed them as stunts. But when his interceptors failed to touch them, he realized too late that minimalism had outclassed magnificence. The Ta-154, weighed down by radar, armor, and bureaucratic demands, could never match the Mosquito's agility. Göring's insistence on perfection, on building an aircraft that could do everything, doomed it to doing nothing well. The fourth angle is psychological. The Mosquito became a symbol of Allied audacity. Crews nicknamed it the Wooden Wonder. Civilians saw it as proof that brains could beat brawn. Each successful raid boosted morale across Britain and chipped away at the myth of German invincibility. Inside Germany, the opposite occurred. The Mosquito was feared and admired in equal measure. Radar operators called it the Ghost. Fighter pilots cursed it as the one enemy they could never catch. Göring himself admitted bitterly in a 1944 staff meeting, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British have geniuses. We have bureaucrats." That statement spread across the Reich like a confession of defeat. The fifth angle is human. In Britain, the Mosquito was crafted by civilians, artists, carpenters, and ordinary men and women who had never seen a battlefield. Their skill turned scarcity into strength. Each plane carried their fingerprints. Each flight was a testament to collective imagination. In Germany, fear governed every workshop. Engineers worked under threat. Mistakes could mean prison. Göring's wrath hung over every design meeting like a storm cloud. When prototypes failed, engineers were accused of treason. Truth became a liability. Creativity died in silence. That silence killed more aircraft than enemy fire ever could. And then there is the moral angle. The Mosquito embodied democracy in motion, a machine built by trust and cooperation. It thrived on the freedom to experiment, to fail, to question. The Ta-154 was the opposite, conceived in imitation, crippled by arrogance. One aircraft proved what a free people could build under pressure. The other proved what a tyrant could destroy through control. By the summer of 1944, the outcome was visible not only in the air, but in the spirit of the nations themselves. Britain's carpenters had outbuilt Germany's engineers. Göring's empire of order was being dismantled by improvisation, and, with every new raid, the sound of the Mosquito's twin Merlin engines carried a cruel reminder that no amount of power could make a dictatorship creative. By the summer of 1944, Göring's wooden obsession had already transformed from an industrial project into a psychological theater. Every new Mosquito raid was a public humiliation, and every Ta-154 failure a private torment. The story now unfolded across multiple human and moral dimensions, each exposing a different fracture in the Nazi system. The first of these was leadership and ego. Hermann Göring had once been a decorated fighter ace in the First World War. To his early peers, he embodied daring and skill. To the men of the 1940s, he had become the caricature of vanity, a man drowning in medals, morphine, and denial. By 1943, the Luftwaffe that had terrified Europe now lay in disarray. Fuel was scarce, pilots were dying faster than they could be trained, and Allied bombers roamed freely over the Reich. Rather than confront the collapse, Göring clung to symbols. The Mosquito was no longer just an aircraft, it was an insult. His pride demanded retaliation, even if logic screamed otherwise. At meetings, he promised Hitler a German wooden miracle. But his promises carried no power. Only fear kept his staff nodding in agreement. Kurt Tank, the brilliant engineer behind the FW-190, later recalled that his team worked under the shadow of impatience. Göring's fury could end careers overnight. The Ta-154 had to succeed, not to win the war, but to soothe the Reichsmarshal's wounded pride. That pride became fatal. The second dimension was fear and truth. In Britain, failures were logged, studied, and corrected. When a Mosquito crashed in testing, investigators dissected the cause without retribution. In Germany, failure meant suspicion. When the Ta-154's second prototype disintegrated on landing, a young engineer suggested the glue was to blame. Within a week, he was removed from the project for defeatist tendencies. That single decision sealed the aircraft's fate. With the truth silenced, the corrosion continued unnoticed. Fear had replaced curiosity. The third dimension was faith in workers. The Mosquito was built not by soldiers, but by citizens, factory girls, furniture makers, and aging craftsmen. They believed their work mattered. The war gave them purpose. De Havilland's leadership trusted them with design adjustments and encouraged initiative. One carpenter in High Wycombe, unable to find a missing component, carved his own replacement from oak. And the part outlasted the aircraft's lifetime requirement. Inside German factories, initiative was forbidden. Workers followed blueprints without question. To deviate was to risk denunciation. Göring's own propaganda praised discipline over inspiration. The result was machinery that obeyed, but never adapted. The fourth was the moral exhaustion of a system built on lies. By 1944, everyone inside the Reich's aviation network knew the truth. The Ta-154 was a disaster. But no one dared write it. Reports were doctored, numbers inflated, test results adjusted to show incremental progress. Göring himself perpetuated the lie. At public events, he boasted of a superior night fighter soon to enter service, even as mechanics cannibalized grounded prototypes for parts. Across the channel, British pilots joked that the Germans had invented the disappearing plane, not because it was stealthy, but because none ever appeared in combat. The fifth and final layer was ideological blindness. The Nazi worldview equated technological progress with domination. Machines were to be massive, metallic, and terrifying. The idea that a simple, elegant design, made of wood, no less, could outperform their industrial giants contradicted everything they believed. The Mosquito's success was a philosophical insult, proof that a democracy's collective intelligence could outthink a dictatorship's command structure. To the Allies, the aircraft was a symbol of ingenuity. To Göring, it was heresy. Even within the Luftwaffe, the contrast became a running joke. Pilots whispered that the British flew with imagination while the Germans flew with permission. That single quip captured the entire war's imbalance. One side evolved, the other obeyed. And yet, amid that irony, the Ta-154 was not entirely without brilliance. Its lines were elegant, its performance, when intact, astonishing. In another time, under another system, it might have been a masterpiece, but the conditions of its birth ensured its death. The same dictatorship that demanded genius had already strangled the oxygen genius needed to breathe. By late 1944, Göring's engineers were exhausted, his chemists desperate, his factories half-destroyed. The Luftwaffe's once sacred name now drew laughter in Berlin's bomb shelters. Every Mosquito raid that screamed through the skies above the capital reminded citizens that the Reichsmarschall's empire had turned hollow. Some Luftwaffe officers began to quote bitterly, "The English have carpenters. We have clerks." It was not just sarcasm. It was a confession. The acknowledgement that craftsmanship, freedom, and collaboration had beaten the machinery of fear. From the moment the Mosquito's wooden shadow crossed Berlin, the Reich's technological myth had been broken. The Ta-154 was its tombstone, and yet the story was not over. The humiliation would soon reach its climax in front of the entire world, when Göring's German Mosquito collapsed not only as a machine, but as an idea. By 1944, the illusion of German mastery was crumbling. Allied bombers owned the daylight. Mosquitoes owned the night. Every week, the wooden aircraft struck deeper into the Reich, not in vast armadas, but in scalpel-like raids that exposed Göring's impotence. January 30th, 1944, the anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. Across Berlin, flags hung limp under the gray winter light. In the broadcasting studio, Göring began his annual address. He was mid-sentence when the air raid sirens howled. Two Mosquitoes swept over the city, their engines a rising scream. Explosions thundered near the station. The broadcast cut to static. Millions of Germans heard the silence. When the smoke cleared, Göring was still alive. But his reputation wasn't. That day became a turning point, both for the Luftwaffe and for the man who once called himself Master of the Skies. He demanded to know why the Mosquito could strike at will. His generals offered excuses: radar interference, fuel shortages, weather. None could explain how a wooden aircraft outran everything Germany could launch. Göring raged that if the British could build such a thing, then Germany would build better. But by then, his wooden wonder, the Ta-154, was collapsing faster than his speeches. The Ta-154A0 pre-series aircraft had entered limited production in mid-1944. On paper, it was formidable. Twin Jumo 211 engines, radar-equipped, armed with 4 20mm cannons. In practice, it was lethal only to its own pilots. The acidic glue that replaced Tego film weakened every seam. Test flights ended in flames, wings folding like paper under stress. On July 13th, a demonstration flight at Langenhagen ended in front of visiting officers. The aircraft broke apart mid-air and exploded before their eyes. Witnesses described Göring standing silent, his face drained of color. That crash ended the program. The order for production was cancelled within weeks. At Focke-Wulf, Kurt Tank wrote privately that the material betrayed us. He was wrong. The betrayal had come from leadership that refused to listen. Meanwhile, the Mosquito's mastery was reaching its height. In February 1944, a squadron attacked the Gestapo headquarters in Aarhus, Denmark, destroying records of the Danish resistance. In March, another strike obliterated the Shell House in Copenhagen, saving hundreds of lives. Each mission proved that precision, not power, ruled the skies. German civilians watched helplessly. The once mighty Luftwaffe, built on promises of dominance, could no longer defend its own cities. Göring's speeches became desperate pantomimes, words about secret weapons that no one believed. His dream of a wooden German equal had turned to ashes. By mid-1944, the Mosquito was evolving faster than the Reich could react. New variants appeared monthly: bombers, pathfinders, night fighters. Each iteration more advanced, each one an insult to the Luftwaffe's stagnation. British crews spoke of their aircraft as alive, its wooden frame warm to the touch after flight, its controls responsive like a living thing. To Göring's men, the Ta-154 felt cursed. One Luftwaffe officer recalled, "It flew beautifully for 10 minutes, and then began to die." Still, Göring refused to abandon the fantasy. He ordered another attempt, another glue formula, another redesign. His generals called it madness behind his back. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, later wrote that Göring was chasing ghosts made of wood and pride. Even Hitler noticed. In a meeting recorded that spring, the Führer asked why Göring obsessed over toy planes, when jets were the future. Göring's reply was defensive, almost pleading. "My Führer, they have beaten us with a wooden plane. It is a disgrace that must be erased." But it was already too late. The disgrace had become history. By summer 1944, the Mosquito wasn't merely an aircraft. It was a strategic doctrine. It guided bombers to targets, scouted U-boat pens, disrupted rail networks, and hunted night fighters. It was a ghost that Germany could neither stop nor ignore. For the Luftwaffe, the Ta-154 disaster was more than technical failure. It revealed the moral rot of a system where no one could tell the truth. Engineers lied to survive. Officers lied to please Göring. Göring lied to preserve his myth. Each layer of deceit glued the failure together more tightly than the aircraft itself ever was. And as the Mosquito roared over Berlin once more, dropping leaflets and bombs in equal measure, one truth became undeniable. Germany's empire of iron had been defeated by craftsmanship and courage. Inside his headquarters, Göring stared at the ceiling during one bombardment and muttered, "They build from furniture and make me look a fool." He was right. That summer, Allied reconnaissance photographed abandoned Ta-154 airframes scattered like coffins across airfields, warped, split, and useless. The wooden fighter, meant to restore pride, had become the Reich's most expensive embarrassment. But Göring's torment was not yet complete. The Mosquito would humiliate him one last time. On his own birthday, before his own staff, in the sky he claimed to control. April 20th, 1944, Adolf Hitler's 55th birthday. Berlin's air defenses were on high alert. Göring had personally promised that this year, unlike the last, There would be no Allied raids to disturb the Führer's celebration. The Luftwaffe had rehearsed its patrols. Flak batteries dotted the city like steel teeth. Every radar station from Kiel to Dresden stood ready. At 11:30 a.m., the first reports arrived. Unidentified aircraft approaching from the northwest, fast and low. Göring dismissed them. He'd heard the same false alarms before. Phantom contacts, reflections, radar ghosts. Minutes later, the ghosts became real. A formation of de Havilland Mosquitoes skimmed over the rooftops of Berlin. Their twin Merlin engines thundered through the city. Within seconds, bombs exploded near the Reich Chancellery. Hitler's honor guards scattered as the shockwave shattered windows across Wilhelmstrasse. Smoke billowed over the parade grounds meant for the birthday salute. The entire raid lasted barely 10 minutes. By the time the flak batteries fired, the mosquitoes were gone, vanished back into cloud at 400 miles per hour. Once again, Britain's wooden plane had humiliated the Reich. Inside his bunker, Hitler raged. Göring, pale and sweating, stood silent as the Führer screamed about wooden toys and Jewish tricks. It was the most devastating blow to Göring's credibility since Stalingrad. When the reports reached the German people, propaganda ministers tried to spin the story as a minor incident. But the damage was already done. Everyone knew. The enemy could strike Berlin at will. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend even its leaders. The raid was more than symbolic. It was psychological warfare at its finest. It told the world that Allied air power now moved with impunity, and that the Luftwaffe's glory days were over. For Göring, it was unbearable. His air force, the instrument he had once wielded to terrify Europe, was now a shadow. Allied bombers flattened Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, and Munich. Jet projects stalled for lack of fuel. Pilots were flying suicide missions in outdated planes. And the Mosquito, the one aircraft he had sworn to surpass, was still flying, faster than ever. That same spring, Göring's inspectors conducted one last review of the TA-154. Only a handful of prototypes remained. Most had warped frames, rotten glue, and cracked fuselages. Mechanics refused to fly them. One airfield commander suggested converting the carcasses into decoys to confuse Allied reconnaissance. Göring approved the idea. His German Mosquito would serve the war as a wooden dummy. It was the ultimate irony. The plane meant to erase embarrassment had become camouflage for defeat. By mid-1944, the Mosquito was everywhere. It marked targets for Lancaster bombers, hunted U-boats in the North Sea, dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, and even performed raids so accurate they destroyed individual buildings without damaging surrounding blocks. To civilians, it was both terrifying and mesmerizing. A whisper followed by thunder. Captured German officers spoke of it with a strange respect. "It mocked us," one said. "It came when it wished, and left when it pleased." Göring's own officers had begun to lose faith. Luftwaffe intelligence reports labeled the Mosquito virtually uncatchable. Fighter units were told to engage only if advantage was absolute. The wooden plane had become the ghost of the Reich's failure, appearing, vanishing, and leaving shame in its wake. Albert Speer, in his memoirs, would later recall Göring's face after the April raid. "He looked like a man whose god had died," Speer wrote. The Mosquito destroyed his belief that technology would always obey power. The Mosquito raids continued through the summer. They hit Gestapo offices, railway stations, and even prison blocks to free resistance members. Each strike was surgical, each one defied interception. Göring's speeches turned increasingly unhinged, promising revenge through invention, yet producing only more ruins. In July, during a staff conference, he reportedly said, "I prefer one good carpenter to 1,000 bureaucrats." The room fell silent. It was an admission of everything that had gone wrong. Behind his words lay a truth he could no longer hide. The Third Reich's obsession with control had killed its own genius. Its engineers were brilliant but shackled, its scientists talented but terrified. No one dared defy orders. No one dared to dream. The Mosquito's success was not luck. It was liberty. And that, more than bombs or bullets, was what Göring could never fight. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Göring retreated to his estates, surrounded by silks and morphine, while Allied aircraft ruled every corner of the sky. His once golden baton lay tarnished, his titles hollow. The Mosquito, the wooden wonder, outlasted him. It was still flying combat missions when the Reich collapsed. In April 1945, as Soviet troops closed on Berlin, Allied Mosquitoes flew reconnaissance over the ruins, photographing the final days of the empire they had once humiliated. Göring watched those same skies from the Bavarian Alps, broken, awaiting the inevitable. He would later confess during interrogation at Nuremberg, half laughing and half defeated. "Yes, the British wooden plane. It mocked me. I could never touch it. They built with heart. We built with orders." Those words would echo through history, an accidental epitaph for an ideology that had mistaken obedience for strength. The Mosquito had not merely outflown the Luftwaffe, it had exposed the limits of tyranny itself. When the war ended in May 1945, the once proud Luftwaffe lay scattered across Europe, its airfields littered with twisted wreckage, its hangars silent. Between the burned-out carcasses of Me-109s and Ju-88s, Allied investigators found the remnants of Göring's wooden obsession, the Focke-Wulf Ta-154. At first glance, it looked impressive, sleek, predatory, with the unmistakable lines of German precision. But closer inspection revealed the truth. The plywood layers had separated, the glue joints were white with corrosion, the wings warped like rotting planks. When British engineers tried to lift one airframe for transport, it cracked apart in their hands. One Royal Air Force officer wrote in his report, "It is as though the airplane has tried to escape itself." Teams from the Royal Aircraft Establishment and the U.S. Air Technical Intelligence Command documented everything. They compared the Ta-154's structure to the de Havilland Mosquito's, and the contrast was staggering. The Mosquito's skin was still smooth and rigid after years of flight. Its bonding was immaculate, its wooden surfaces tight and dry. The German imitation, by contrast, was already decomposing. The Allied analysts understood immediately. This was not a failure of design, but of environment. The Mosquito had been born in trust and tested in freedom. The Ta-154 had been born in fear and tested under threat. In Hatfield, British de Havilland's engineers read the captured German reports with astonishment. They had built their aircraft in sheds and carpentry shops, without punishment, without ideology, and had defeated a war machine that had enslaved a continent. It was, as one British engineer wrote, proof that the human spirit cannot be regimented into genius. For the Germans who survived the project, the lesson was bitter. Kurt Tank, now living under Allied interrogation, defended his creation. "It was not the design that failed," he said. "It was the system. We could not work freely. We could not speak freely. That is why it died." Allied officers nodded. They had seen the same truth in every captured laboratory. Germany's engineers were brilliant, but their brilliance had been forced into obedience. The Ta-154 wrecks were shipped to Farnborough for detailed study. British scientists noted that, in theory, the design was excellent, light, balanced, and capable of superb speed if properly built. But the chemical disaster of the substitute glue, the infamous Laklebstoff, had eaten through the Reich's credibility. Laboratory analysis revealed that the resin's acidic byproducts had destroyed the wood fibers over time. turning the aircraft into what one researcher called a skeleton pretending to be solid. In the end, only a handful of Ta-154s had ever flown operationally. Most were scrapped without combat. Their story joined the long list of Germany's Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons that promised everything and delivered nothing. The Mosquito, meanwhile, became the quiet symbol of Allied intelligence and adaptability. Its success was studied worldwide. American engineers used its methods to explore bonded laminates, a technology that would later lead to carbon composites. Even the Soviets took note, copying some of its construction principles for early post-war aircraft. In Britain, the plane that Göring had called a disgraceful toy was now a national treasure. Veterans called it the aircraft that did everything and feared nothing. In museums and air shows, the Mosquito's legacy outshone the fame of bombers 10 times its size. But for Germany, the Ta-154's failure had deeper consequences. It was more than a lost aircraft. It was a moral collapse disguised as a mechanical one. The Reich that had prided itself on technical supremacy had been defeated by artisans, carpenters, and open minds. The empire of order had been undone by improvisation. When Allied historians reviewed the Luftwaffe's collapse, one conclusion appeared again and again: innovation cannot survive under fear. The wooden plane that Göring had mocked had proved it. Twice, first in the sky and then in history. Yet the story did not end with wreckage. The lessons buried in those shattered wings would shape post-war science itself. The post-war months turned Göring's humiliation into a case study for the modern world. Allied intelligence reports circulated through universities and engineering circles, each one repeating the same theme, that the downfall of Germany's wooden wonder was not mechanical, but moral. In 1946, a British technical paper summarized it bluntly: "The enemy possessed knowledge, but not liberty. The Mosquito was built by free men. The Ta-154 was built by frightened ones." That single sentence became a mantra for post-war design philosophy. Across the Allied nations, engineers dissected the Ta-154's flaws. They discovered that when exposed to humidity, the substitute glue released acetic acid strong enough to eat through metal fittings. Pilots had complained that the cockpit smelled of vinegar. Now investigators knew why. It was the scent of corrosion, of chemistry rushed by dictatorship. From those failures came unexpected progress. British chemists at Farnborough refined the tests used to measure adhesive acidity, laying the groundwork for modern composite bonding. American researchers at Wright Field developed epoxy resin formulas directly inspired by the Mosquito's success. In this way, Göring's disaster became the seed of future aviation materials. But the human lessons cut deeper. Captured Luftwaffe officers told their interrogators that they had felt trapped between reason and obedience. "We were building lies," one engineer admitted. "The more we hid the truth, the more the planes fell apart." Another said simply, "We forgot that a craftsman must believe in what he makes." In occupied Germany, those words found a strange echo. The nation's reconstruction depended on reversing everything the Reich had stood for: decentralization instead of control, cooperation instead of fear. The wooden plane that had failed in war became an example in peace. Technical schools used the Mosquito and Ta-154 comparison to teach young engineers that safety and innovation required honesty above all. Meanwhile, the Mosquito's legend continued to soar. Restored aircraft mapped the ruins of Europe, photographed the birth of the United Nations, and served in the early Cold War as reconnaissance scouts. Its methods of laminated construction influenced furniture, boat building, even the early automobile industry. What Göring had dismissed as carpentry turned out to be the foundation of an industrial renaissance. In contrast, the Ta-154 disappeared almost completely. Only fragments survived, a wing spar here, a section of fuselage there, scattered across museums in Britain and Germany. Curators noticed how quickly its wood decayed, how fragile it felt compared to the mosquito's polished shell. Each crack seemed to whisper the same story. Strength built on fear cannot endure. When historians interviewed surviving members of Focke-Wulf's wartime team in the 1950s, most spoke without bitterness. They no longer defended the project. They described how paperwork suffocated creativity, how deadlines became political theater. One engineer said softly, "We knew we could not win. Not the war, not the argument." And so, long after the battles ended, the Mosquito and the Ta-154 remained locked in silent dialogue. One a symbol of freedom's agility, the other a relic of tyranny's paralysis. By the time West Germany rebuilt its aviation industry in the 1950s, the lesson had been internalized. New companies like Messerschmitt Bölkow Blohm promoted open collaboration and independent research. Values the old Reich had crushed. The nation that once failed to build a reliable wooden aircraft would, a generation later, help design Europe's most advanced composite jets. The shadow of Göring's envy lingered, though a reminder of how arrogance can corrode even the finest minds. In every lecture hall and museum display, the story endured that during humanity's darkest war, victory belonged not to the empire of steel, but to a handful of carpenters who trusted their craft. When the last mosquito engines roar to life today, their hum carries more than nostalgia. It carries a warning. Every dictatorship believes it can command creativity, until the glue holding its lies together begins to dissolve. In the end, this story is not about wood and glue. It is about two civilizations, one that trusted its people and one that feared them. The de Havilland Mosquito was born from scarcity and imagination. It carried no armor, no luxury, no waste. It was built by hands that knew the feel of grain and glue, not by decree, but by belief. It flew not on arrogance, but on the quiet confidence of those who understood that intelligence is stronger than intimidation. The Ta-154 was born from envy. It was conceived in a system that demanded obedience, not creativity. Results, not understanding. It was an aircraft built under duress, a machine suffocated by fear. Proof that even the most advanced nation collapses when its thinkers are silenced. History remembers the mosquito not just as a weapon, but as an idea that simplicity can be genius, and freedom can outfly force. When Göring stared at the wooden wreckage of his German Mosquito, he was not looking at a failed aircraft. He was looking at the mirror of his own regime, glossy on the surface, crumbling within. Decades later, the Mosquito still flies in museums, its polished birch wings gleaming softly under hangar lights. Each takeoff carries more than sound. It carries the echo of a time when creativity saved a nation. The Ta-154, meanwhile, exists only in fragments, reminders that tyranny builds beautifully and breaks completely. In that contrast lies a truth greater than war, that the strength of a nation is not in its steel, its armies, or its commands, but in its capacity to let free minds create without fear. And as the Mosquito's twin Merlins roar once more in the modern air, the message of its victory still whispers through the sound. That imagination, like wood, endures. And that freedom, once airborne, can never again be contained.